Hello, I'm Mark Payne with the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Council that brings historical figures to life through first-person portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to both nonprofit and for-profit organizations across West Virginia. History Alive is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. They're entertaining and educational. We encourage your organization, school, or event to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Lab presenters have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Lab presentation is not a play. It's an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to your program offerings. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Alive character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio, Benjamin Franklin.
I'm Dr. Benjamin Franklin, printer from Philadelphia. I was born on January 17th, 1706 in Boston. I was the 15th child of 17 children of Josiah and Abiah Folger Franklin. I was the youngest son. I had 2 sisters younger than I. And when I was quite young, my parents thought that I should enter the ministry and become a preacher in the Calvinist faith. And so they sent me to school. I went to school for 2 years, and my formal schooling ended when I was 11 years of age. At that time, because my father was a tallow chandler, maker of candles and soap, he had me to come into his candle shop, and I began to cut wicks, to dip candles, and I hated that trade. My heart was at the sea. I wanted to be a sailor, but my father refused to allow me to do that because I had an older brother, Josiah, who went to sea and never returned. And so my father had me work for him in his candle shop, and as I say, I hated that trade. But I learned to read. The 2 years that I was in formal schooling, I learned to read, and I loved reading. So my father decided to apprentice me to my older brother James, who had a print shop in Boston. And so I went with James, and there I learned the trade of printing. I loved printing. I became very adept at it, very, very good. And working for my brother, being his apprentice, as usually happens with an apprentice working with the master, my brother would sometimes be very abusive. I wanted to write for him. He had a newspaper. In fact, it was the very first independent newspaper in New England called the New England Courant. I wanted to write for it. My brother James refused to let me write for it. And so eventually I decided, because of the abuse, he would beat me on occasion, I ran away. I ran away at the age of 17. I went to New York, eventually to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, I acquired a job in a print shop there. And eventually, with the passage of time, I was able to buy that print shop and take over a failing Philadelphia newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. I started publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette with great success. While in Philadelphia, at a very early age, I started an organization called the Junto. The Junto was an organization of young men who were craftsmen, who were merchants. There were shoemakers, there were candle makers, there were printers, and we gathered together every Friday evening in order to sing songs. We gathered in a tavern, we would drink rum together, and we would talk about the issues of the day, religion, politics. We were very, very active, and we loved our Junto. We would answer questions like, who do you know that's rich? How did they get that way? Who do you know whose businesses have failed? Why did they fail? And we learned from that. We learned how to improve ourselves, and the Junto was a very wonderful organization. It became my interest then to not only publish a newspaper, I began an annual publication called Poor Richard's Almanac. Poor Richard's Almanac was the typical almanac giving the dates for planting and harvesting, and it also gave me a stage on which to give my ideas and my opinions, and I did that readily. Poor Richard's Almanac. I published it for 25 years, and the last publication was in 1757, and the very last publication I had an article in Poor Richard's Almanac called Father Abraham's Sermons. It was a treatise on the business of investing money, finance, and it became very, very popular and was eventually published as a book. So that was the end of Poor Richard's Almanac. I retired from publishing at the age of 42. I'd acquired enough wealth at that time to devote myself to science. I loved science. I loved to experiment. I began a study of electricity, which was very little known at that time. And in my laboratory and my workshop, I developed a static electricity generator. And I was able to see by touching two poles together a spark of electricity jumping from one to the other, which very much resembled lightning in the sky. And so I began an experiment then to try to determine if lightning was composed of electricity. And so one day I went out with my young son William. I set a kite aloft in the air with a silk string that I had dampened with water. It was in the face of a thunderstorm, and about eye level I attached a metal key. And we flew the kite. I wanted to try to draw lightning from the sky to see if indeed lightning was composed of electricity. It seemed that the experiment was a failure, and we were ready to call it a day, and then all of a sudden I reached up with my knuckle close to the key, and I saw a spark jump from that key to my knuckle, and I knew then that lightning was composed of electricity. And from that, I was able to develop one of my greatest inventions, the lightning rod. I was known for my inventions. I invented the lightning rod, the Franklin stove. I invented bifocal spectacles. I invented a flexible urinary catheter. Enough said about that. And I invented an extended arm with which one could reach up to the top of the shelf and retrieve a book from the top of the shelf without having to climb up on a stool or a ladder. I love to tinker with things, to invent things. And then my interest developed into politics. I entered into politics, became a councilman in Philadelphia. I eventually was elected to the Second Continental Congress. And in the Second Continental Congress, because Parliament in England had begun to tax the colonies without any representation whatsoever, we felt that this was unjust. And we were trying to develop something whereby we could go to Parliament and say, do not tax us without discussing with us what this tax is all about. Eventually, that developed into the direction that we were going into to begin to work for independence. We wanted to break off from the mother country. We wanted to break off from England. And so in the development and the time of the Second Continental Congress, we began to write up a document that we refer to as a Declaration of Independence. I was one of a committee of 5 to write up the Declaration of Independence. And then on July 4th, 1776, we approved the Declaration of Independence, and we eventually broke off from England. The president of the Second Continental Congress, John Hancock, made the statement, "Gentlemen, after signing this document, we must all hang together." My response to that was, indeed, we must hang together or we will most certainly hang separately. And so we broke off from England, and this was at the time of the Revolutionary War. I was sent to France in order to try to elicit from France help in fighting the Revolutionary War. We couldn't win the war without help from some other foreign country. Our General George Washington did the best he could, but there was very little that he could do to win battles in the Revolutionary War. Eventually, France did come to our aid, and in 1783, we signed the Treaty of Paris, and with the Treaty of Paris, the Revolutionary War ended, and America then was truly free. Then we entered into a progress in the Congress of writing a constitution. This was in 1787. We worked on a new constitution for the United States of America. We hammered it out after much debate, much discussion, much argumentation. And then at the end of that convention, that constitutional convention, all of the delegates filed out of Independence Hall onto the streets of Philadelphia. And there was a woman standing in the crowd. And she shouted out to me, "What sort of government have you given us, Dr. Franklin?" And I responded to her, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. A republic, if you can keep it."
We're back with Dr. Benjamin Franklin. Dr. Franklin, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your schedule for being with us today.
You're most welcome.
And as doctor, you are indeed Dr. Franklin. I'd like to ask you how you acquired your doctoral titles.
Well, actually, I had only 2 years of formal schooling, and so it was not so much an earned doctorate, but I received 2 honorary doctoral degrees, one from St. Andrews University in Scotland, and the other from Oxford University in London. The one from London was because of my scientific studies. The English were very much impressed with what I had done with the study of electricity and my various inventions, and so they gave me the honorary degree. I also received an honorary degree from Harvard University in Massachusetts. But from the time that I received the doctorate from St. Andrews, I started to identify myself as Dr. Benjamin Franklin. But whenever I signed my documents, I was trying to be very humble. I would just simply sign them B. Franklin, Printer.
And it was, I might be wrong in this, but you've always been well known for popular sayings and interesting sayings, and I assume that those you sort of came upon those or developed those during your time as a printer. Could you share some of those maybe with us?
Especially in the years that I was publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette and also Poor Richard's Almanac. I would pick up various aphorisms from other documents, other writings. Some of them I developed myself, and I became rather well known for a number of them. For example, early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. It's a good saying, it's a good aphorism. I never stuck to it myself. I like to sleep late in the mornings and stay up late at night. Another saying was, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Another one, he who lies down with dogs will rise up with fleas. A penny saved is tuppence clear. Now, that came back to me as a misquotation, as a penny saved is a penny earned. But what I actually said was, a penny saved is tuppence clear, means basically the same thing. Learn to save, learn to invest your money, and hopefully you will acquire a certain amount of wealth by frugal investing and spending and so forth.
I know that during your monologue that you just shared with us, you spoke about your time in France, and you made several trips across the Atlantic Ocean, and at a time when that's not, it's not a done deal that you're going to make it. How many times did you make the journey, and how did you spend your time while you were on ship?
Very good. I made 4 separate journeys to Europe. You might say 8 voyages over and back. My first one was at age 21. I was given a passage to England to go and learn updated forms of printing, what had been developing in the printing industry, that I was to bring back to Philadelphia and to my employer there. Now, in traveling across the ocean, across the Atlantic Ocean, this took 2 months, sometimes 2.5 months, to go from the colonies over to England, and usually longer coming back because of the headwinds and so forth. But I made 4 separate journeys, 3 to England and 1 to France.
So how did you spend your time?
Oh, on board ship?
I mean, if you're making a journey that's taking 2 months, how did you pass the time?
Well, I passed the time by reading, doing a lot of writing. In fact, my last voyage to England was in 1757, and it was the time that I was compiling my last Poor Richard's Almanac, the last edition. And on the voyage to England, I wrote a story about Richard Saunders. That was the pseudonym of the main character of Poor Richard's Almanac, and couched it in a story where Richard was riding into a village, and there was a large oak tree there. A man was giving a talk there, and the talk was on money, how best to invest your money, how best to get a return on your money. And I referred to it, or gave it the title of Father Abraham's Sermon. Well, that later was developed into a booklet called The Way to Wealth. And so it was writing. I would write on board ship. A lot of times on board ship I would do experimentations, dropping cords into the ocean, tracking the stream, the currents of the water. And in fact, my last voyage, which was to France and back, coming back, I made a study of what I referred to as the Gulf Stream. And I shared that knowledge with sea captains that in tracking the Gulf Stream, in the journey west, the voyage west from Europe to then the United States of America, would take 2 weeks less if they would go along the Gulf Stream itself and tack according to the prevailing winds of the Gulf Stream, and it made the journey somewhat quicker coming to the west. And so that's how I whiled away my time on shipboard, and a lot of times just simply in conversation with the sailors. I loved the sea. I loved to be on the sea, and in a sailing ship, it was always most enjoyable.
And your feelings towards the sea was quite different than your wife's, wasn't it?
Yes. Quite often I tried to get Deborah to travel with me, to go to England, but Deborah, unfortunately, was just simply terrified of the ocean, terrified of the concept of sea travel. and so she never ever went with me on a voyage across the ocean. She would stay in Philadelphia. We had a little shop there that she ran, and she took care of the household chores. In fact, on my third trip to England, I told her that I was going to England. I would be gone just for a very short time. I'll be back. I know that we're going to build a house. Wait for me to come back to Philadelphia before you start work on building this new house. Well, as soon as I left on shipboard to go to England, Deborah went to work and built the new house without me.
Well, seems fair, I guess.
Yes. Deborah was very, she was a unique woman, very independent, and a very deep thinker.
Well, you spent a lot of time, obviously, separated from your wife
Yes.
in France. And tell us a little bit about your time in France and, sort of what you were doing, what your mission was, and how you went about that.
Right. My mission at the end of the Second Continental Congress, after we had signed the Declaration of Independence, we were immersed in the Revolutionary War, and we were losing that war. We had appointed General Washington as the head of troops, but their victories were very few and far between. And so we knew that we could never win the war by ourselves, that we needed foreign help. We needed armaments, we needed soldiers, we needed all the help we could get. And so the Congress appointed me to go as commissioner to France to try to convince the French government to help us in the fighting of our Revolutionary War. That was my primary purpose. That's why I went to Paris. And there I struck up my acquaintanceship with Charles Gravier, who was the Comte de Vergennes. He was the foreign minister for France. And he and I became very close, and we worked together, and he worked with the French court to try to get us help and assistance from the French government. So that was my main purpose for being there. Excuse me, go ahead.
And while you were there, you certainly were successful in your mission, I think.
Yes, very successful.
You had a pretty good time while you were there too, didn't you?
Oh,
you enjoyed. Did
I
you
had
enjoy
a
being there?
wonderful time in France. I loved France. I loved the ambiance of French society. I loved meeting the people of France. I didn't speak French all that well, but the French people, because of my reputation, coming from America, I was thought of as being this rustic American who had come to France. And the French people, especially the aristocracy, fell in love with me. I became very popular there. My pictures were all over the place, my portraits. They put my face on snuff boxes. They put my picture on pitchers and on cups, drinking cups.
So you're like an American celebrity.
I was an American celebrity in my years in France. I loved it. And of course, when I arrived there, it became well known that I loved the ladies. And so all of the gentlemen of France, especially in the aristocracy, the politicians, would always introduce their wives to me. And because of my love for the ladies, I loved to flirt with them, and they loved that. They flirted back with me. Never any dalliances, never any intimacy with them. By this time, I'm in my 70s. I just simply enjoy the ladies, and I love the conversation. I love the salons. I love playing chess. I had some very close friends. Madame Briand, we would meet weekly for a game of chess and lunch, and we got along very, very well. In point of fact, because I was a widower, I had proposed marriage to Lady Madame Helvetius, who was a widow herself, but she refused my request for marriage. I think because her being of the Catholic faith, me being from American, being of the Protestant faith, She was not at all comfortable with the prospect of marrying a man from the new United States of America, and so she refused my proposal.
Well, that was probably one of your few unsuccessful
Yes.
forays while you were in France.
Yes.
Well, at this time, I would like to make note that this isn't really Benjamin Franklin. This is really Leon Alexander
Yes.
of Charleston. And Leon, thanks for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
Leon is one of our newer History Live characters now, and we welcome you to the roster for the History Live program. I'm going to ask you what I ask most of my guests here, which is, what was it about Benjamin Franklin that inspired you to research him and to want to portray him?
Yes. I had the occasion 12 years ago. The Charleston Light Opera Guild was going to put on the musical 1776, which is a musical, a comedy drama version of the writing of the Declaration. And one of the major roles in that musical was Benjamin Franklin. And I had seen it on Broadway, and I thought, I'd like to audition for that part. And so I went to the auditions, and the director there, Nina Passanetti, gives out a form. What role are you auditioning for? Would you be interested in some other role if you don't get the one you're auditioning for? And I put down, I'm auditioning for Benjamin Franklin. I'm not interested in any other role. And so I landed the role of Benjamin Franklin in that musical. And that really triggered for me an interest in colonial history, and especially that era of the American Revolutionary War, the writing of the Declaration, and I became enamored of the character, the personality of Benjamin Franklin. And so that's what triggered it. I played the role actually twice. In that season for the Charleston Light Opera Guild, and then I lived in Morgantown for 4 years, and there was a community theater group there that put on 1776, and once again I portrayed Franklin, and also had the honor of being the assistant director of the show.
Well, excellent. I would like to ask you, when you were researching Franklin here in the last minute that we have, what are a couple of sources, if people are interested to learn more about Franklin, that you would suggest?
Well, Franklin himself wrote an autobiography. He started it late in life. He started it as a letter to his son William, but it developed into a full-blown autobiography, and it's very thorough, very complete with Franklin's experiences. The book that I use, I call it my Franklin Bible, is Walter Isaacson's book, Benjamin Franklin, An American Story. Also I use as a reference David McCullough's book, John Adams. There's a lot of material in there about Benjamin Franklin. Also Carl Van Doren wrote a book, Benjamin Franklin, Volume 1. It was a 700-page tome. And I don't think he ever wrote a second volume to that. He tried to define Franklin, and he never could.
Okay. Thanks, Leon Alexander, for being here with us today, and thank you for tuning in to History Alive.